Thank you, Carolyn. So our keynote speaker holds a bachelor in health sciences and nutrition, and I'm glad to present Colby D'Onofrio up to the stage. Colby, it is your time.
Good morning, everyone. I want to start off by saying a huge thank you for you all for coming out today. I know you're busy, you have a lot going on, and it's really wonderful to see so many beautiful faces out here coming together to unite and become stronger together as a community. So, as both Carolyn and Vanessa got it right, my name is Colby D'Onofrio. I come from an organization called Leah's Pantry, and I'm going to tell you a bit about who we are. So today we're going to talk a bit about how to take a trauma-informed approach to food distributions. And if you aren't sure what this means, don't worry, because that's what we're going to talk about. So I want to give you kind of a quick overview of who Leah's Pantry is. If you haven't heard of us, we are a nonprofit based in California with a nationwide footprint in the area of trauma-informed nutrition. And what we do, our work falls into kind of 3 buckets. We do a lot of capacity building for partner organizations like y'all, like Feeding America, San Bernardino, and Riverside, and we do a lot of training. So we get to talk a lot about these fun things, these fun topics like trauma and how it affects our nutrition and our ability to be healthy. We also consider ourselves thought leaders, and so we like to put on presentations like this one to talk about these ideas and spread awareness about the importance of including a trauma-informed approach in our services. So to start it off, this is a question that we often get, which is, what is a trauma-informed approach and what am I supposed to do with it? Is that me causing that sound? Some background music going on, okay. If that's me, let me know. I could talk louder too, if that's better. All right, think we're good? Woohoo! I didn't realize I was going to do a dance routine up here too, but anytime, anywhere, right?
We're pausing. We're gonna switch mics. Woohoo! No more dance parties. Sorry, everyone. So early in the morning too. Thank you.
Check, check. All right. Take 2. So a question I often get is, what is a trauma-informed approach and how is it different than trauma-specific services? So trauma-specific services are evidence-based services that deal with the repercussions of trauma. They are the goal is to address the symptoms of trauma. And this is not what we're talking about today, right? This is what like therapists, psychologists, this is what mental health professionals do, and we are not asking you all to become therapists on the spot in a 40-minute speech, so don't worry. What we are talking about today is how to bring a trauma-informed approach, which is just a universal approach to our work that assumes that trauma exists universally, meaning anyone at any time can be dealing with the effects of trauma and adverse experiences. And if some of those words are like, I don't really know what that means, how that looks, don't worry, because that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is something that everyone can do, because really at the heart of a trauma-informed approach is compassion and relationship building. It's about building connection with our communities and building positive relationships that reinforce positive experiences. You may have heard about the curb cut effect, and this is a concept coined by a policy expert named Angela Blackwell. And the curb cut effect, as you can see on this screen, is the idea that when we make accommodations for the experiences of just a few, we actually benefit everybody involved. So when we do something like provide a curb cut in a sidewalk, although it's initially intended to benefit people who use wheelchairs, it also helps people who are pushing a stroller, using carts. Maybe they're on a bike or wheeling luggage. It also is a lot nicer for us as walkers and runners and pedestrians. So the idea here is that when we make accommodations for just a few people, ultimately it benefits everyone. And in a pantry setting, yes, we're making these accommodations for the experiences of just a few of our customers, but it benefits all of our neighbors and it also benefits staff and volunteers. And so we want to point this out real quick before we dive into it, because this can lot of information, and like suddenly you have a lot to do, all these changes to make. But the truth of it is that adopting a trauma-informed approach is not accomplished through a singular particular technique or checklist. It requires constant attention, caring awareness, sensitivity, and possibly a cultural change at an organizational level. So a trauma-informed approach is more about being in a certain state. It's a state of being, it's a mindset. It's not something that we check a few things off, we're done and we're good to go and we can move on with our day. It's something we're constantly working at and always striving to be better at. All right, so with that, we're gonna start with what I like to call the meaning of food in life. And we all have a relationship with food, and sometimes it gets a little complicated. So I want y'all to take a moment to do some reflection. I want you to think about your favorite food, maybe the way it smells, the way it tastes, what it looks like, and then think about, why is that your favorite food? Is it because of the way it looks, the way it tastes? I see a smile over there. Someone's thinking about their favorite food. It's a good one, isn't it? Is it because it makes you feel a certain way? Is there maybe a memory attached to that food that brings joy to you? And then I want you to think about how you feed yourself. Do you like to cook? Do you prefer to eat out? If you like to eat out, do you like to get takeout and eat at home? Or do you prefer to eat in the restaurant? If you cook, what kind of food do you like to make? Why do you make that food? And how did you learn to cook in that way? When we start asking ourselves these questions, we begin to see that our relationship with food is a bit more complex than just calories and nutrients, right? Maybe your favorite food is your favorite because it reminds you of family get-togethers as a child, or maybe it was the chicken noodle soup that your mom made for you when you were sick. If you are a chef, maybe you cook the way you do because you like the process of cooking. Maybe you like to cook with your family, bring your children into the kitchen. If you like to eat out, maybe you prefer the restaurant over takeout because you like the variety of dishes, the way that the food is presented, the ambiance, the smell of all that cooking food. Now, there's no wrong answer here, right? The idea is just to do a bit of reflection. And the goal is just that you'll probably realize that there are a variety of influences on your eating habits. So a researcher named Naomi Arbit and her team at Columbia University also started to realize that there's a variety of ways that we relate to food. And so they created what's called the Meaning of Food in Life questionnaire that asks a series of questions and then breaks down our relationship with food into 5 categories, also called domains. The first domain is the aesthetic. And this is how food looks. Food can be a work of art, it can be beautiful. There's the social aspect of food, how food connects us with our culture, our community, maybe it brings us together with friends. There's the health part of food, that food can be a way that we nourish our body and our mind. Then there's the sacred aspect. Maybe food connects us to our culture, our community, or even religious traditions. And finally, we have the moral domain, which is about how food impacts the choices we make around food, impacts other people and the environment. And you might be looking at these and maybe one jumps out to you and you're like, oh, I'm definitely a social eater. I'm a social eater. I love to cook with people. Food is my love language. When someone's going through a hard time, the first thing is I'm like, what can I cook you? And maybe some of these other ones are like, oh, on Sundays, yeah, I do lean into the health domain. Other times, maybe I lean into the aesthetic domain. And the point here is to realize that there's a variety of ways that we do relate to food. And we can kind of categorize them into these domains. But how this relates to food distributions is that for people who are experiencing tough circumstances, they're often forced to accept food that has little to no meaning to them. Food at distributions can often get reduced down into meals given out, household serves, or pounds given out in a day. And that's because we're busy, we got a lot to do, we gotta keep track of our numbers, right? But we believe that when we support the variety of relationships with food that our customers have, it actually helps promote long-term health-promoting change in their lives. And so when we can provide food that has meaning to our customers, it ultimately benefits their health, their well-being, and creates a sense of community. So with that, we're going to dive into the 5 R's of a trauma-informed approach. Now, what I want to point out first is that this is a circle. Like I said, there is no one checklist to complete to be trauma-informed. At different points in your work, you're probably going to be at different parts of this circle. You might even hit a couple of them at the same time. So let's start with the first R. The first R is realize the impact of adversity and positive experiences. Once you realize that, and I'm going to tell you how to realize that today, don't worry, we go into the recognize part. How do we recognize the signs of trauma? And then from recognize, that's also tied heavily into resilience over there on the left in yellow. And resilience is the prevention and healing that happens with support and care in our communities. And then we're going to spend some of our time today talking about how to respond with trauma-informed principles and practices. When we have all 4 of these top R's down pat on lock, we can then resist re-traumatizing our community members, and we can take adequate steps to repair and apologize if we do accidentally mess up. And that's an important part here too, is that being trauma-informed in no way means you're perfect. It recognizes that we're all human. We all have good days. We all have not so good days. What's important though is that we try our best, we take care of ourselves, we take care of other people, and we lean into building positive, compassionate relationships. So before we can jump too far into the 5 R's, we first need to understand how we can explore nutrition security through a trauma-informed lens. And to start with that, we need to talk about what is trauma. Now, trauma is a word that's used pretty casually these days, but unfortunately, it's often misused. Getting your Starbucks order messed up and then being stuck in traffic and being late to work, that's not traumatic. Although some people might feel like it is. Trauma does have a true definition. And to point out first, trauma is a neurobiological response. It's hidden up at the top, but trust me, it's there. And what that means is that trauma is something that happens in both our bodies and our mind. We often think of trauma as being an emotional response, which it definitely is, but trauma can also have deep, deep impacts on our bodily functions and our physiology. And so trauma is what happens when bad things happen to people who are not surrounded by adequate protection, love, and care. Ultimately, it's when we face adversity and it's too much, too fast, too soon for our bodies to regulate with and cope. It starts to feel like there's no end in sight and our body is overwhelmed and cannot emotionally regulate and bring us back to a safe state of rest. Over a long time, unchecked stress turns into physical, like I said, it happens in the body, and psychological, it also happens in our brain, damage. And over a long time, when we continue to experience tough circumstances, the world starts to feel like it's profoundly unsafe, even after those circumstances may have concluded. So this is what we call trauma casting a long shadow. Even after the event is over, whether it's one event or multiple events, it can continue to feel like that event is still happening in our body and mind, even though the event has concluded. Now, I want to point out here something that's really important. We all have different ways that we cope with stress, that we respond to stress. This is because of our upbringing, it's how we relate to the world, and it also has a lot to do with genetics. So trauma is not just one event, right? Some people might experience the same event, but the way in which they experience it is different, and therefore the effect that it has on them can also be different. So like I said, we might all experience the same event. Like let's think about like 9/11, right? We all experienced 9/11 as a nation. That was one huge, challenging, very scary event for all of us. But the way we experienced it was different depending on where we were at the time, where our loved ones were, what our line of work was, and who we had to come home to and talk about that event with, how we were able to recover from it. Therefore, the effect it had on us was very different. So I want to drive this home, that there's not one aspect of trauma. There's not one thing that's going to give you trauma. Trauma is the event. That part can be traumatic, but it also is how a person experiences it and the effect it has on them at the end of the day. So we're going to start off with the first R of a trauma-informed approach, realize. Now I've been using this word adversity, and adverse experiences. And some of y'all might be familiar with it, some of you might not be. So an adverse experience is a scary or bad event. It can be something like the death of a loved one, or all of these things that you see on this slide. There's a lot of different types of adversity. And adversity can be particularly detrimental and challenging to our health when we experience it as children. So some of y'all might be familiar with the term adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. But the truth is that adversity can affect us at any age and can have deep and impactful effects on us. So on this slide, you can see that we can lump adverse experiences into 3 buckets: the household, the community, and the environment. And in each of those, we have what are called loud and quiet adversities. Loud adversities are something pretty obvious, like a natural disaster, or domestic violence, or varying types of abuse. These are things that are really scary, and our society recognizes as really challenging. Now, we also have what are called quiet adversities. And quiet adversities are things that might not be as obvious. Things like what you can see circled in red here: lack of food security and homelessness, also referred to as houselessness. Now, in Riverside and San Bernardino counties, over 415,000 people are facing food insecurity right now. That's a lot of people. And of those, 33,000 are older adults in Riverside, and 36,000 are older adults in San Bernardino. And although this area actually does have a better rate of houselessness than the state average, it's estimated that almost 8,000 people are still affected by that quiet adversity. And that's an estimate, and that probably means there's actually quite a bit more than 8,000. Now, on our community level, you can see quiet adversities like poverty and lack of access to nourishment. Poverty encompasses many adversities and is itself an adversity. And between San Bernardino and Riverside, over 556,000 people are living in poverty. That's a lot of people, y'all. And living in poverty can make it challenging to access nourishment. So it's important to realize here that we often have especially quiet adversities happening together at the same time, which can make the compounding effect of them that much more detrimental. So that's adversity. And we now have a working definition for trauma, right? So what does trauma look like? What does it look like when adversity shows up in our lives and has that deep and compounding and impactful effect on us? Well, to start off, a lot of trauma and adversity is tied up in stress. And we all experience stress, right? Like, if you haven't experienced stress, come talk to me. I want to know what you're doing. But it's actually important that we do experience stress. And I know this sounds a little nutty, but when we experience stress, our body and our mind expand their capability to handle challenges. And when we get through that stress, we get to the other side and we're like, dang, I did that. Okay, I can take on another challenge of life. So there's 3 types of stress. The first is positive stress. Yes, stress can actually be positive, although it doesn't feel like it in the moment. Positive stress is something like starting a new job, moving to a new state. It's stressful. It gets some of our stress hormones going, but ultimately, it's probably pretty exciting. Then we have tolerable stress. And this stress is generally temporary, and it gets us going. It's not quite as fun as positive stress, but it's still something that we can cope with. Now, neither of these types of stress are associated with trauma. Trauma falls into the category of toxic stress. And toxic stress is categorized by prolonged activation of our stress response in the absence of protection or relief. So these are things like we just talked about on the previous slide, those adverse experiences, when those just keep coming again and again and again, and we feel like there's no end in sight, there's no light at the end of the tunnel, and our body can get stuck in a stress response. On this slide, you can see an optimal stress response, right? We have on top what's called hyperarousal, also known as fight or flight. And on the bottom, we have hypoarousal, also known as fawn or freeze. And so when we get pushed out of what's called our window of tolerance, we end up in one of these places. Now, for most of us, when we have just positive and tolerable stress in our life, if we get pushed out, we can get back in pretty quickly. And we also have the ability to, when we do experience stress, we can keep ourselves in our window of tolerance. We can manage that stress. When we're in our window of tolerance, we are in what's called our ideal place, our rest and digest. This is the place where we can be flexible, we can be curious, we can use our higher thinking brains, we can regulate ourselves, we can relate to other people, we can even be creative, we can make decisions, we can think through problems, we can even plan for our future. And in our bodies, this state is critical that we are in so that we can properly absorb nutrients, we can digest things, and we can also do really important heal and repair processes in our bodies. Here, though, you can see the not so ideal stress response, the toxic stress response. Now, when we get stuck in either hypo or hyperarousal, we start to exhibit some of these characteristics you can see on the screen. In hyperarousal, we have things like anger, near constant anxiety, chaotic energy. We might be hypervigilant, always looking over our shoulders, and we might even just be hyperactive. In the hypoarousal, it might look like chronic depression, emotional numbness, withdrawal, feelings of shame, social disconnection, and overall a lack of motivation. And also what's different about this slide is that you can see where we had the window of tolerance on the other slide, it was kind of up and down, and we were mostly in our window of tolerance. This slide, we're not in our window of tolerance for any prolonged period of time. If anything, we're simply just bouncing back and forth between hypo and hyperarousal, or we're stuck in one of those. So this is what a stress response might look like for someone who's in a place of toxic stress after experiencing a lot of adversity, and this is where trauma comes in. So this is what someone who's experienced a lot of adversity now has trauma, and this is what their emotional regulation is going to look like. It's also important to note, and rather than saying it happens in the brain and the body, all of those were emotional characteristics that affect our brain, but trauma also has deep, deep impacts on our body and our physiology and our ability to be physically healthy. So it can affect things like high blood pressure, chronic pain, sleeplessness or oversleeping. We might have digestive problems, or we might have appetite changes, maybe eating too much or not eating enough. We could also be chronically tired, and chronically tired can also go hand in hand with sleeplessness. So you're chronically tired, but you're never able to sleep. That's a pretty rough place to be. We might also have really low blood pressure, and we could have also poor digestion, and again, appetite changes. But also remember that someone might not be stuck in one or the other. They could be, but they also could be bouncing back and forth. So they're experiencing both ends of the spectrum without finding a happy medium in the middle. Now, it's important to recognize that there can be some stress and adversity around needing to access a food distribution. First off, there's the stigma. I think we all know that there's a societal stigma around having to ask for help, having to turn to social services. Even though it's necessary and we're all friendly, smiling faces who want to help, it can still feel really scary. Then there's the restriction aspect. We are a place of order. We have to have rules, we have to have procedures that allow everyone to get enough food or to distribute the food fairly so it can be fair and equal and equitable for the people accessing our distribution. But for someone who's in need, this can feel like they're being monitored maybe, or they're not going to be able to get enough. It can feel really scary, and that also goes hand in hand with what's called the feast or famine cycle. And this cycle proposes that when we are in periods of abundance, after experiencing prolonged periods of not having enough, it is a deep biological urge for us to stock up and take as much as we can as quickly as we can. It's actually a really interesting thing that our brain does back to our time of hunter-gatherers when we didn't know how long we were going to have food for. So we wanted to get as many calories and as many nutrients when we could because we didn't know when we were going to run out. Now in modern day, we're not hunting and gathering anymore, but this biological urge is still very present. And this might look like someone taking more than the allotted amount out of distribution, going to multiple different organizations to get food. It might even be them getting back in line to try to get double bags in one day. And lastly, there can be a sense of cultural oppression. And this is not intentional, but when someone doesn't have access to food that has meaning to them, that connects them with their culture, it can feel like a form of oppression. All right, so we have a working definition of trauma now. We know what it looks like when trauma starts to impact our brain and our bodies, right? And that can feel really like a bummer. You're like, dang, Colby got up here and she is just really starting this conference off on a low note. No, don't worry though. Now we're gonna talk about the good part, which is positive experiences and resilience, because humans and communities are incredibly resilient. So resilient is the process of the body and mind adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. Now, it's interesting that resilience actually requires we experience some stress. Remember how I said experiencing like positive, tolerable stress helps our nervous system expand its capacity for stress. It reminds us that we can do challenging things and get through it and still be okay. And when we realize we're still okay, that's when we start to develop resilience. Resilience can also be thought of as the ease in which we can stay within that window of tolerance in the face of adversity, or the ease with which we can return to that window when we have been pushed out. And as we can see on this slide, we do a lot better when we have other people by our side to navigate tough situations. I don't know about y'all, but I would be not having a good time if I had to go down that rapid in a kayak by myself. I'd be stressed, like bad stressed. But in a boat with other people, that kind of looks fun. It'd be a little stressful, but I'd have enough support around me and a bigger boat, and I feel pretty confident that we could navigate those rapids. Now there's a few buckets that positive experiences can fall into. The first is strong families and communities. As I mentioned previously, positive, compassionate relationships are the bedrock of a trauma-informed approach, and they're also the foundation of resilience. Having people that we can turn to in our time of need, whether it's when we fall down and get a scrape as a child, we can go to someone for a Band-Aid and a hug and they'll wipe our tears away, or it could be a food pantry when food starts to run low in our community. There's also rich cultural traditions. Being in touch with those helps us feel like we're part of something bigger. It helps us feel connected with other people and like we're understood by a greater community. And this is also why offering culturally relevant food at our distributions is so important, and this can help battle that aspect of cultural oppression in a distribution. And finally, there are self-healing practices. Yes, we do really well when we have other people by our side, but it's also important that we develop some healthy coping mechanisms, some strategies to help ourselves heal and recover after we experience stress. These could be things like spending time in nature, physical activity, a nutritious diet, or meditation, just to name a few. Now, the bummer here is we can't stop adversity and trauma and stress. So if we think about those like rain clouds, up at the top it says stress, adversity, scarcity, and trauma, up in those rain clouds. We can't stop the rain, right? Like once you see the weather report and you're like, ooh, there's a 100% chance of rain today, you can't go out there and be like,
Don't rain!
it's not gonna work, right? We know the rain's gonna come. But we can't prepare ourselves. We can't put on a rain jacket. We can go outside with an umbrella. So when you hear the term trauma-informed nutrition security, I want you to think about you holding up this umbrella for your neighbors and your communities to protect them against the storm of life. And that umbrella includes things like access to resources, quality nourishment, sharing of knowledge and education, the building of positive relationships, and interconnectedness among community members and community organizations. Now, I like this quote that Dr. Stephen Porges says, safety isn't the absence of threat, but it's the presence of connection, right? Like we can't get rid of the rain, but we can provide an umbrella. So we just went through 3 of the 5 R's of a trauma-informed approach, right? We talked about adversity and what that looks like and what the definition of trauma is. We talked about how to recognize the signs of trauma and resilience. Remember that window of tolerance. And then we talked about resilience and how we can support that. And all of this can feel really conceptual. And you're like, yeah, that's cool information, but like, what am I supposed to do with it? Well, now we're gonna go into the respond portion of this. And this is where we're going to talk about how you can take steps to protect yourself, to protect other people, and to provide positive experiences for your community through your food distributions. The first thing we have to do is we have to respond to ourselves. Self-care is extremely important in our line of work. It starts with ourselves. When we take care of ourselves, it gives us the energy, the awareness, and the compassion to then build relationships with other people. And compassionate relationships are key to building healing communities. So if you think back to that slide about positive experiences, remember how self-healing is actually a positive experience? We can respond to ourselves, and that is part of a trauma-informed approach, self-healing and self-care. And if we don't take enough self-care, we're at risk of all of these things, along with many more. If you've worked in social services for a long time, I'm sure you've met someone who has been in that sector for decades. They're super dedicated to the cause, they have a ton of knowledge, but they might be a little hard to work with, maybe a little stubborn, maybe a little cranky. They might even produce less than ideal work, or they feel like they're the only person who can handle all these problems. When we don't care for ourselves, our ability to care for and connect with others becomes diminished, and if we aren't careful, we can really burn ourselves out. I like this slide because it reminds us that we can't pour from an empty jug. On here you can see a few examples of what self-care can look like. Things like being creative and expressing yourself, taking care of your physical health and comfort, taking care of your emotions, caring for your mind and thoughts, looking after your financial health, and caring for your spirit. The idea of self-care has kind of been co-opted by mainstream media in recent years and used as a tool to get us to buy something new or splurge on an expensive treatment. And while that's going to feel good in the moment, that's going to be kind of fun, you know, online shopping. When we get our credit card bill, it suddenly doesn't feel very good. And that's actually, you know, we're actually not looking after our financial health in the moment. And so true self-care is defined as something that is good for you now and good for you later. And when we do adequate self-care, it supports building authentic relationships because it allows us to be responsive to others. We're less stressed, we're more regulated, we can be in the moment, we can be present in conversations and interactions. It helps us practice reciprocity and collaborate with others. It helps us to define and hold appropriate boundaries. Yeah, sometimes saying no is the best form of self-care. And ultimately, once we get right with ourselves, we can be vulnerable, and that allows other people to feel safe and like they can be vulnerable in our presence too. So once we've responded to ourselves, how can we respond to others? Well, there's one thing we can do, and it's called reframing. And it's really easy to do, and it's totally free. Reframing helps us approach a difficult situation with a neighbor with curiosity and compassion instead of judgment and assumptions. And when we reframe something, the first step is to pause. Take a breath, check in with yourself, and see what judgments and assumptions might be coming to mind. We might have biases that are underlying, and they might lead us in a direction that we don't want to go. So we need to get curious about these. What am I bringing to this work? Why am I having this assumption? Biases can be a scary word, but we all have them. It's a deep biological and psychological urge that we all have to categorize things as safe, not safe, good, bad. But the world isn't actually that black and white. So once we get curious about those biases, hopefully we have been doing good self-care practices so that we can be aware of them and ensure that our biases and assumptions aren't leading us in a direction that we don't want to go. Because then the last option, or the last step here, is to see if there's another explanation for the behavior that you're seeing. What might be going on in someone's life that causes them to behave in the way that they are? Ultimately, reframing encourages us to approach a situation with curiosity and compassion instead of judgments and assumptions. Now, there's one example of this that I'd like to share, is that I was working at a food distribution, and there was this guy who came up in this huge, nice Mercedes-Benz SUV. And someone next to me was like, what is that guy doing here? Like, that car's nicer than mine. He doesn't need to be here. And we all kind of were like eyeing him, and we're like, man, he's trying to take advantage of the system, that really sucks. But when he got to the front of the line, I was in a super rural area. I was in a pretty rural area, way up north in Humboldt County, Northern California. And if you know anything about that county, a lot of it is there's like kind of like semi-metropolitan and then real rural. And it's a lot of mountains, so things are geographically secluded. So he gets to the front of the line, and we're like, okay, how many households? And he's like, I'm picking up for 14 seniors in my community of Alder Point, where they don't have access to a grocery store, and none of them have cars and aren't able to get food. And suddenly, I felt really stupid. Like, wow, I was sitting there assuming this guy was trying to take advantage of us, and he was doing a phenomenal service, spending his time, his own personal time, out here to ensure that the seniors in his community, I got goosebumps, could get food. Because that's what healing communities do. They care for each other. And when we can show up for our communities in that way, without our assumptions and without our biases, we can really help heal our communities. Got a little teary-eyed on that one. Didn't expect that. So here's the challenging behaviors we might see in a food distribution. Things like food hoarding, frustration over questions asked for intake or registration for benefits, poor willpower in food choices. And willpower is in quotes because willpower is this idea that we can just change our situation with enough gusto and gumption, right? But if that were the case, well, I'd be rich and famous already, but I'm not quite there yet. And then there's maybe neighbors with a rude or a bad attitude. So with food hoarding, that person might just be seeking protection and safety because they're scared of when food is gonna run out again. Remember that feast or famine cycle. Someone who's frustrated over all these questions we have to ask. They might be worried about how that information is going to be used, and they might be feeling a lack of control giving out so much personal information. Poor willpower in food choices. Well, they might not know how to cook with a certain ingredient, a certain healthy ingredient. They might just be looking for predictability when food choices are limited. Maybe they're worried that their family isn't going to like a new ingredient, and so the food will end up going to waste. And then neighbors with a rude or bad attitude. They might just be trying to assert their autonomy in a world where their choices are very limited. And if we remember that window of tolerance, they might be emotionally dysregulated. They're living outside their window of tolerance. So it's not something that they actually have a ton of control over. I like this slide and this image because I'm sure you have all heard that saying, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And that is very, very true when we're working with people and populations who've experienced a lot of adversity. The behavior that we see on top is just the tip of the iceberg because we don't know what's going on below, and there's all these things that are impacting their behavior today. All right, so we got right with ourselves. We learned how to be a little more compassionate with other people. And now how can we as a distribution and an organization respond to our communities? Well, there are these things called the trauma-informed principles that are put forth by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. And these principles are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and social and historical responsiveness. And you'll see that two of them are kind of grayed out, because we're just going to go over those four that are in bright colors today, because those are the four that I think are most applicable to pantry work. Now again, like the 5 R's, notice that these are arranged in a circle. None of them is first, none of them is most important, but what is interesting is that when you use one of these principles, or when you see one of them in action, you're often, almost always, going to find at least one other being used as well. It's also important to note that whether or not you realize it, a lot of y'all are probably doing a lot of these principles already. So let's start with safety. In safety, we seek to establish safe physical setting, interpersonal interactions, and a culture of well-being. We seek seek to destigmatize food insecurity and personal dietary habits. And what's really important when we're talking about safety is that safety can look different for each and every one of us. So we need to understand safety as defined by the people and the community that we are serving. And safety has a few aspects to it. There's both physical safety, like, an environment, the safety of this room, and then there's the psychological or emotional safety, how people feel. And let's start with emotional safety. Emotional safety is about creating an environment where people feel safe enough to show up as their authentic selves, ask for what they need, and return for services in the future. It doesn't mean that we have to create or turn all of our pantries into a Zen center where everything is calm and you're never gonna mess up or ever trigger anyone. No. Like I said, being trauma-informed is about compassion, it's about building relationships, and that is how we can support emotional safety in our distributions. One part of this is creating a welcoming environment, having friendly faces on site, and making sure that neighbors do not feel like a burden to their community. And the beauty of a physical environment can really support this. So here on the right, you can see an example of a full in-person shopping choice client pantry. And it looks pretty good, I think. This is a place that I would love to shop. I'm sure many of us would love to shop here. Now this is kind of like a grade A example, and we don't expect everyone to be able to do this because we all have limitations and we're all doing our best to work with what we got. But when someone walks into a pantry like this, there's a feeling of beauty, a feeling of like, I'm worth it. I'm worthy of beauty. I'm worthy of good things in my community, and that helps people feel like they are not a burden. Now, feeling emotionally uncomfortable can also come from a fear of the unknown. And sometimes, I don't know if y'all ever experienced this, you want to go to a restaurant, and you go to look up the menu, and there's no prices on the menu. And you're like, that makes me a little uncomfortable. I might go there, and my meal could be $30, it could be $100, it could be $300. And that is enough to turn me off of not wanting to go to that restaurant. So having things like consistent hours, locations, as much as possible, the same staff and volunteers on site, friendly faces, and communicating things up front. So put yourself as much as you can in the shoes of a first-time neighbor. Is it clear where to go? Is it clear what documents are needed? How long it's going to take to get food? What's available that day? You can see on the image in the left that some of this emotional safety need is anticipated. You don't need to ask, yes, it's free. That's like putting prices on your menu. And when we do provide these communications, we really want to be sure that we're providing them in the languages that our neighbors speak. Whether it's written communication, having people on site who speak that in person, that creates a feeling of being connected to people's cultural traditions, if you remember back to positive experiences. And it creates that feeling of safety, that they're accepted here. They can show up as their authentic self and speak the language that they're most comfortable using. Now then there's the physical safety, and this one can be a little more obvious. It's things like ensuring we have adequate lighting, that the area where we are in is clean, it's organized, it's free of tripping hazards. Using things like shelf labels can be really helpful with that, so people know what's what. Also, you can see in this image on the, which one is that? The pantry image, front, my left, my right. But there's bins. Things are nicely organized, and the bins add a nice aesthetic to the space. The next principle is trustworthiness and transparency. So in this one, we start with relationship building and connection. We provide relevant, reliable, and high-quality services to our neighbors. We ensure expectations and processes are predictable and clear, and this is where policies and procedures come into play. And ultimately, it's really important that we understand that trust is earned over time, but can also be broken very quickly. I was speaking with someone once who was working with tribes in his community, and I asked him, how did you do the timing, the pacing, how did you know when it was the right time to move forward? And he said, well, we move at the speed of trust. And I thought that was pretty profound. We move at the speed of trust when the people we're working with are ready. So in a pantry space, I think having policies and procedures are super key, especially something like a respect and dignity policy, as you can see in yellow, or in the yellow with the yellow border. It's especially important to have something like a respect and dignity policy in case you encounter difficult behavior. This way you can point to it, right? And hopefully you want to put it in a place where it's clear, easy to see, everyone can read it, and it's in languages that all of our neighbors speak. So when we do encounter difficult behavior, we can reference that. And this way the neighbor who's exhibiting said behavior knows that we're not making these things up on the spot to target them. These are the rules that apply to everyone. And you don't have to be the individual bad guy, right? You can fall back and say like, I'm sorry, this is just the policy that our entire organization uses. It's not like you as one individual are trying to target another person. Policies and procedures are also really important for volunteers and staff. Hopefully there's a procedure like a standard operating procedure so that the pantry runs consistently and smoothly regardless of who's running it that day. And that goes back into safety, right? It's reliable, it's a consistent process that our neighbors can come to expect. It also provides an opportunity and knowledge for staff and volunteers so that if they have questions, if something comes up in the distribution, they know that they can turn to their policies and procedures to help them guide them through a challenging situation. And if an issue does come up, they know who to turn to, they know where to go, and they know that their issue is going to be handled in a timely and compassionate manner. As much as we can, trustworthiness and transparency is about communicating things up front before they happen as much as possible. And you can see an example of this in the other image. This was a pantry that was going to return to indoor service from doing a drive-through, and so they distributed these flyers in every pantry bag in multiple languages. It had images on it as well. On the other side, it had like a little map so people could see exactly where to go. And they started handing these out at least a month before they did the transition. So people knew that change was coming. They knew they were still going to get food. Like imagine how scary it would be if you didn't know and you showed up one day for a drive-through and no one was outside. You'd think you weren't going to get food that day, and that'd be really scary. So as much as we can, we want clear, upfront communication. They had this translated into multiple languages so that people are aware of processes and changes before they occur. And our next one is collaboration and mutuality. In this one, we acknowledge that neighbors are the experts of their own lives. We build partnerships with community organizations along with neighbors, and we level power differences between staff and neighbors. So there's some ways we can do this. Now, if we are going to collaborate with people and promote mutuality, we need to understand their needs and desires. And we can do this by asking for feedback. You can see an example of a full neighbor survey in the center image, but this can be a lot. It takes a lot of time both on staff and volunteer ends as well as on the neighbor ends. So we can also do things like asking a question of the month and recording responses, putting up a poster and providing stickers so people can post they can vote on what their answer is. However it is, make sure that you're asking these questions in the languages that neighbors are most comfortable in. Whether it's having someone on site who speaks that language and can ask in person, or it's translating a paper survey and giving that out. When a neighbor sees their needs and their desires reflected in the pantry and what the pantry offers, this really contributes to a feeling of mutuality and having a say in how things go down. Now, the concept of collaboration can also be applied to other organizations in your community. This could be providing on-site referrals, like a warm referral and a warm handoff is always better than just having to cold call some services and ask for help. And it can also look like inviting other organizations to your distributions to table and provide information. And you can see an example of that with the Anthem 10. That's a healthcare representative at a distribution, helping neighbors understand their benefits and get signed up for benefits. Now, overall, one really great way to encourage collaboration, if possible, is to create an advisory board of neighbors. This provides them an opportunity to talk with each other, hear each other's stories, for them to collaborate, and for them to have some say in how the distribution handles their feedback. One important thing in this last image that I want to point out is that when you do get feedback from people, principle, it's really important that we communicate back what we heard. Because nothing sucks more than giving your time, answering some questions, especially if it's a long survey, and then walking away and being like, okay, what happened? Like, I never heard back about anything. So there's a variety of ways you can communicate back what you heard. This pantry decided to do a word cloud, but however it works best for you, communicate that you heard what people said and how that's going to affect change, if at all. All right, for our last principle today is empowerment, voice, and choice. In this one, we recognize all people as wise, creative, and resourceful. We incorporate individual and community voice. We encourage choice in the pantry setting, and we support everyone's dignity and ability to shape their own lives by emphasizing strengths, autonomy, and self-advocacy. So let's start with voice, because we just talked about that with surveys. Asking for neighbor feedback, creating an advisory board to elevate neighbor voices, these are all great ways to incorporate voice. Then there's choice. Now, choice can look like a variety of things. Ideally, in-person shopping where neighbors have the ability to choose their own items and put them in a bag is ideal, but it's important to recognize this is not always possible. Then there's hybrid choice, so offering choice as much as your organization can. This can look like, you can see an example of a menu order form here. This is what a drive-through distribution did. So when people got in line, they'd get the order form, they'd check off what they wanted, they'd hand it back to the volunteer would bring it back, people would bag it, and then when they got to the front of the line, their bag would be loaded into the car with the items that they had chosen for that day. You can also display the items, like the image on the far image is showing on that table. Lay them out so people can see what's available, or you could do something like a sandwich board or an A-frame. However you communicate what options are available and provide people with as many options and choice as possible, that's always best. Now, what the pantry in the far photo also did was they bundled these ingredients into recipe bundles. So people could start to understand how to cook with new ingredients. Maybe they saw like, okay, I know how to cook with beans, I know how to cook with corn, I'm not quite sure what to do with broccoli, but I see it together with two items that I'm familiar with, and there's a recipe right there. Okay, I can try something new. Education is key to empowerment. Whether it's indirect education, like offering a recipe card or informational sheets, or direct education, like doing on-site nutrition or cooking classes. However you can provide education, this really helps empower people to have autonomy over their health and their choices. And ultimately, when we empower our neighbors, this circles back, and this leads into principles 1 and 2, safety and trust. And just like safety and trust, it's going to take time for people to start to feel empowered. All right, so now you have a better understanding, I hope, to kick this conference off of how to respond to trauma in your communities. And I'm sure a lot of y'all are doing a lot of these things already. You may have just not realized that they're part of a trauma-informed approach and that you are helping heal your communities when you engage with your community in this way. You also now have a deeper understanding of the impacts of adversity, what trauma is, how trauma can affect us, and how the effects of trauma can look in our communities, and what resilience is. That's that positive side, those positive experiences, how we can promote resilience in our communities through our work as a food distribution. So we as pantries are a vital resource to our communities, but we also know that food insecurity and nutrition insecurity do not exist in a vacuum, meaning the people accessing our services are likely also going to other organizations for services as well. When we acknowledge that and take steps to meet our neighbors' need through interorganizational and interpersonal connection and promote dignity, respect, and empowerment, we help build thriving, healthy, and resilient communities that ultimately benefit everyone. So with that, if you'd like to know more about this topic, please consider checking out our podcast. It is put on by Leah's Pantry, and I am one of the co-hosts along with my fabulous colleague. We interview people doing great work in the SNAP-Ed, CalFresh Healthy Living world, and organizations who are really embodying a trauma-informed approach. So you can hear some examples about how other people are doing it, and maybe it'll inspire you to take on a new way to adopt a trauma-informed approach. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, our website, and this is a QR code that'll take you right to our website where you can listen to our podcast. This is my email. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me with any questions. I love talking about this stuff. I also have business cards on that black table in the back, as well as some more information about Leah's Pantry, the trainings we offer, and how we can offer support to you and your organization. I want to say a huge thank you to you all for having me, to everyone who's putting on this phenomenal conference. Thank you all for being here today. I'm so happy and honored to kick off this amazing day. Thank you.
Thank you, Colby, for that tremendous presentation on trauma-informed